Boxing gyms were supposed to be places of discipline, of respect, of hard-earned growth forged through sweat and struggle. But sometimes, the line between pushing someone to be great and breaking them completely blurred. Mike Tyson had spent his life inside gyms, from the rough, unforgiving training halls of his youth to the world-class facilities that had built him into a champion. He had seen trainers push their fighters to the edge, test their limits, demand more than they thought they could give. But he had also seen the other kind of trainer. The kind that didn't teach. The kind that didn't inspire. The kind that broke spirits instead of building them. And today, he was staring at exactly that. From across the gym, Mike watched as a trainer, a man too big to ever have stepped into a ring himself, but loud enough to make up for it, stood over a young fighter who could barely hold himself up, his body trembling with exhaustion. "Get up, you worthless piece of SHT!" Asterisk, the trainer barked, his voice echoing off the walls, his face twisted in anger. The kid tried, he tried, but his legs gave out again, sending him crashing back onto the mat. The trainer didn't reach out to help. Didn't offer a hand. Didn't lower his voice. Instead, he kicked the side of the heavy bag next to the boy's head, making him flinch as the leather smacked against the chain above. "You want to fight or you want to quit like a coward?" the trainer sneered. The gym fell silent. Fighters turned, pretending not to see but hearing every word. Mike Tyson didn't pretend. He stepped forward. And in that moment, the entire energy of the room shifted. Boxing gyms were places where fighters were built, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. They were supposed to be places of respect, discipline, and honor. But the moment Mike Tyson stepped inside this gym, he knew something was off. The air was thick with sweat, the rhythmic sounds of gloves smacking against heavy bags filled the space, but there was something else, an energy that felt wrong. Then he heard it. A voice, loud, cruel, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Get up, you worthless piece of SHT!" Mike's jaw tightened. And when he turned to look, he saw exactly the kind of man he despised. Boxing gyms had a rhythm of their own, a constant hum of gloves pounding against bags, the sharp calls of trainers pushing their fighters, the metallic clang of weights being racked and unracked, the unmistakable scent of sweat and discipline filling the air like an unspoken contract between every man inside those walls. These places weren't just about throwing punches, they were about shaping warriors, about molding boys into men, about teaching respect, control, and the ability to push past limits. But today, as Mike Tyson stood inside this gym, something felt different, something felt off, something in the air wasn't right. And the moment he heard the voice cutting through the sounds of training, his suspicions were confirmed. It wasn't the kind of voice that motivated. It wasn't the kind of voice that pushed a fighter to be better, to dig deeper, to keep going when their body was begging them to stop. It was the kind of voice that tore down instead of built up. "Get up, you worthless piece of SHT!" Mike's body stiffened. His jaw clenched. He knew that tone too well. He had heard it before, in places where people who never threw a punch in their life thought they could break the ones who actually did. His eyes scanned the gym, searching, finding the source of the venomous words. And when he saw it, when he saw the trainer standing over the kid who could barely hold himself up, he knew this wasn't just another day at the gym. The fighter on the mat wasn't a man. He was barely more than a boy. He looked 18, maybe younger, his body lean but exhausted, his skin glistening with sweat that had nothing to do with success and everything to do with being pushed past the point of failure. His arms shook as he tried to push himself off the ground, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, his chest heaving like his body was begging him to stop. But he didn't stop. Because he had been told stopping wasn't an option. He tried. He tried. And his legs gave out. He collapsed again. The trainer didn't reach down to help him. Didn't offer him a moment to recover. Didn't speak with encouragement. Instead, he kicked the side of the heavy bag next to the kid's head, the leather smacking against the chain above, the sound exploding in the gym like a gunshot. And then came the words that made Mike's blood boil. You want to fight, or you want to quit like a coward? The entire gym fell silent. Fighters turned their heads, their punches slowing, their jump ropes hesitating mid-air, their feet stopping mid-step. They heard it. They all heard it. But no one moved. Because that's the thing about places like this, people follow the unspoken rules. You don't interfere with another fighter's trainer. You don't question how a man prepares his students for war. You don't break the code. But today, Mike Tyson was about to break every single rule in that book. Mike's gaze locked onto the trainer, taking him in fully now, the way he carried himself, the way his chest puffed out, the way he shouted commands but never stepped in, the way he stood over a boy half his size like he was something to be feared. But Mike had seen men like this before. Men who had never been in a real fight, but talked like they knew what pain was. Men who wore sweatshirts with gym logos, barked orders, screamed at kids trying to prove themselves, but never once had the guts to put on the gloves and step into the ring themselves. Men who didn't teach. They just controlled. And as Mike Tyson watched the trainer sneer down at the kid on the ground, he knew one thing for certain. That wasn't how you built a fighter. That was how you broke one. Mike wasn't the kind of man to jump into situations where he wasn't needed. He wasn't the kind of man to tell another trainer how to do his job. But this wasn't training. This was abuse. And Mike Tyson? He wasn't about to let that slide. He stepped forward. And in that moment, the entire gym changed. Mike didn't have to announce himself. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to do anything but move. Because when a man like Mike Tyson steps forward, the air shifts, the energy changes, the very foundation of a room feels different. And when the trainer turned and saw him, for the first time since he started shouting, since he started throwing his weight around, since he started treating that kid like he was less than human, the trainer hesitated. Mike stopped just a few feet away, standing tall, his broad shoulders squared, his presence a force all its own. And the trainer? He saw it now. He saw that this wasn't just another fighter standing in front of him. This was Mike Tyson. And the way Mike looked at him? It was the kind of look that could break a man before a single punch was even thrown. No one spoke. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Because everyone in that gym knew something was about to happen. Something that wouldn't end with fists, but would end with one man realizing he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Mike tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving the trainer, voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the silence. That how you train your fighters? The trainer's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but he didn't respond. Because what could he say? He had been yelling a second ago. Screaming. Barking orders. Acting like he was the biggest man in the gym. But now, the real biggest man in the gym was standing in front of him. And the fight had already started. Without a single punch thrown. The gym wasn't silent, not completely. The rhythmic sound of gloves hitting bags still echoed through the space, jump ropes still whipped against the floor, and trainers still barked instructions at their fighters. But the energy? That had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was there, a crack in the atmosphere, a shift in weight, a moment where the focus of the entire gym subtly moved toward one thing. Mike Tyson had stepped forward. And that changed everything. At first, the trainer acted like he didn't see him. Like he didn't feel the pressure of Mike's presence in the space. Like he could keep going, keep yelling, keep controlling the kid on the mat without acknowledging the man who had just turned his full attention on him. But Mike knew better. He had been in too many fights, too many moments of tension, too many battles where men pretended they weren't afraid until it was too late. And this trainer was afraid. Even if he didn't show it yet. The kid who had been struggling to get up, the one who had been taking every insult, every verbal beating, every drop of venom from the trainer's mouth, he felt it, too. He didn't look up right away. Didn't dare. But Mike saw it, The slight turn of his head, the way his fingers twitched against the mat, the way his breathing changed just slightly. Because when you're at your lowest, when you're broken down to nothing, you recognize when something shifts. And something had just shifted. The trainer, still trying to act like nothing had changed, clicked his tongue, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Like he still owned this moment. "You want to be a fighter or not?" he sneered, his voice sharp, loud, meant to carry across the gym, meant to show dominance, meant to remind everyone that he was still in charge. But the words? They landed differently now. Because Mike was watching. And everyone else in the gym? They were watching Mike. Mike didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had spent a lifetime making people listen without ever needing to be the loudest man in the room. "That how you train your fighters?" he asked, his tone low, even, dangerous in the way only controlled power can be. The trainer froze, just for a second, just long enough for the mask to slip. Just long enough for Mike to see the hesitation behind his eyes. Because that was the problem with men like this. They could scream all they wanted, bark orders, push kids past their breaking points, but the moment they were faced with someone who had actually fought, they lost their voice. The weight of the room had shifted completely now. The other fighters weren't pretending to train anymore. The coaches weren't calling out instructions. They were watching. Not the trainer. Not the kid. They were watching Mike. Because everyone in that gym, whether they wanted to admit it or not, knew what was happening. They knew this wasn't just a moment. This was a lesson. And Mike Tyson was about to teach it. The trainer squared his shoulders, adjusting his stance, trying to regain whatever authority he thought he had left. But authority is a fragile thing, and once it starts to crack, there's no putting it back together. He forced a scoff, shaking his head. "I train fighters to be tough," he said, his voice just a little too defensive, just a little too sharp. "You don't get to be a champion by going easy." Mike's head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a friendly smile. A knowing smile. Mike took one step closer. Not aggressive. Not threatening. But enough to make a point. "Champions don't get built by being broken," Mike said, his voice steady, solid as a right hook. The trainer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Because he knew what Mike was saying. And more importantly, everyone in the gym did, too. The kid on the mat finally lifted his head. His breathing was still heavy. His arms were still shaking. But his eyes? They were different now. He had just seen something no one had ever shown him before. He had seen that he wasn't alone. And for the first time since this so-called training session had started, he wasn't scared anymore. He pressed his hands against the mat. And this time, he got up. The trainer didn't say anything else. What could he say? He had already lost. Not in a fight. Not in a battle of words. But in something much bigger. Because Mike Tyson had just reminded an entire gym, an entire room of fighters, an entire world watching from the edges of their own training mats. Strength isn't about how loud you are. It's about what you stand for. And today, Mike stood for the fighter who couldn't stand for himself. The silence inside the gym was thick, almost suffocating, the kind of silence that only happens when something real is unfolding, something that isn't just another day, just another training session, just another argument between two men who thought they knew more than the other. The sounds of gloves hitting heavy bags had stopped, the squeak of sneakers against the worn floor had faded, the rhythmic jump ropes had all but stilled, and yet, no one moved, no one spoke, no one dared to break the moment that had taken over the entire gym. Because in this moment, every single fighter, every trainer, every onlooker understood one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about one kid on the mat, this was about something much bigger. And in the center of it all stood Mike Tyson. The trainer's arms remained crossed, his chest puffed out, his stance solid, but it was a performance now, a thin, cracking facade that he was desperately trying to hold together. He had been the loudest man in the gym just minutes ago, his voice cutting through the air like a knife, his commands filled with an authority that no one had dared to challenge. But now, standing in front of a man who had actually been in the ring, who had actually fought, who had actually lived through the kind of pain and sacrifice that boxing demanded, his authority meant nothing. Mike Tyson wasn't yelling. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't throwing his weight around. And that was exactly why the trainer was losing. Mike's voice had been calm, steady, powerful, not loud, but commanding in a way that didn't require volume. That how you train your fighters? The words hung in the air, weighty, undeniable, pressing down on the trainer like the force of a 12-round war inside the ring. It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation, a challenge, a statement of absolute certainty that what this man was doing wasn't teaching. And the trainer felt that. Because for the first time since he had started barking orders, he had to justify himself. The trainer let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, forcing a scoff that didn't quite land the way he wanted it to. "You think I'm too tough on them?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of defensiveness now, his words faster, as if trying to keep up with the power shift that had already taken place. "This sport isn't for the weak. If he can't handle a little pressure here, how's he gonna handle getting hit in the ring?" Mike didn't react right away. He just looked at him. And in that moment, every fighter in that gym understood something the trainer clearly didn't. Mike Tyson wasn't about to have a conversation. He was about to teach a lesson. Mike took a step closer, slow, measured, deliberate, his expression unreadable, but his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. "Toughness," he said, his voice carrying through the gym, even though it was barely louder than a whisper, "ain't about how much you can take before you break." The trainer's lips pressed together. Mike tilted his head slightly, watching him. Waiting. Then he took another step. "It's about how much you can take, and still stand up again." Mike turned his head toward the young fighter still sitting on the mat, still breathing heavily, his arms still shaking, his body still weak from being pushed beyond his limits. "He ain't weak," Mike said. "But you're making sure he never learns how to stand." For the first time since this had started, the young fighter on the mat looked up, not with exhaustion, not with defeat, but with something different, something new. Recognition. Because he had just been given something more valuable than training, more valuable than endurance, more valuable than any technique a coach could teach him. He had been given a reason to believe in himself again. And that changed everything. The trainer shifted his weight from foot to foot, his arms still crossed, but his stance wasn't as firm as it had been before. His authority had been slipping for the last few minutes, but now it was gone completely. Because he had spent his entire career controlling fighters through fear, through yelling, through intimidation. And none of that worked when the most dangerous man in the room wasn't afraid of you. Mike didn't need to throw a punch. He had already won. The other fighters in the gym weren't looking at the trainer anymore. They were looking at Mike. Because every single man in that room understood that they had just seen something important. They had just seen what real strength looked like. Not power. Not aggression. Not yelling. But the ability to stand in front of a man who thought he could break people and remind him that real fighters don't break. Mike exhaled slowly, shaking his head, then turning back to the trainer one last time. "If you want to make champions," he said, "then teach him how to stand." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And in that moment, every fighter in that gym knew something had changed. The trainer said nothing. There was nothing left to say. But as Mike reached the exit, as the air in the gym finally seemed to breathe again, the young fighter on the mat pressed his palms against the floor, pushed himself up, and, finally, stood. Because this wasn't just about winning fights. This was about learning how to stand up, even when someone else is trying to break you. And today, that kid had just learned how. The moment Mike Tyson turned his back on the trainer, the atmosphere in the gym changed in a way that no one could quite describe, but everyone could feel. The air was still thick with tension, still humming with the weight of what had just happened, but something was different now. Something had shifted, something had cracked, something had been rebuilt. Because this wasn't just about a conversation. It was about power. It was about control. It was about a lesson that every single person in that gym had just learned, whether they wanted to or not. And at the center of it all, standing on legs that were still shaking from exhaustion but stronger than they had been just moments ago, was the young fighter who had just lived through it. The trainer still stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared like he was still trying to hold on to some version of authority that had already slipped through his fingers. But he wasn't fooling anyone anymore. Because the thing about power? Once it shifts, once it's taken from you, once someone has stood up and shown the world that you aren't as strong as you pretend to be, there's no getting it back. And in this moment, it was clear that the trainer had nothing left to say. Because his power had never been real. And real power had just walked out of the room. The fighters in the gym weren't just standing there anymore. They weren't just staring, weren't just pretending to go back to their training while secretly watching from the corners of their eyes. They were seeing everything differently now. Because for years, they had been told that toughness was about breaking. That pain was something to be thrown at them until they either withstood it or walked away forever. That weakness was something to be punished, not something to overcome. But today, they saw a different kind of strength. Because Mike Tyson didn't have to break someone to prove he was strong. He just had to stand there, speak, and remind everyone in that gym what real strength actually looked like. The young fighter had spent months in this gym, coming in every day, pushing himself past exhaustion, trying to prove that he belonged. But today was the first time he felt like he actually did. Because before today, he had been fighting alone. Before today, he had been trying to hold himself up while the world tried to knock him down. Before today, he had believed that if he wasn't strong enough, then maybe he didn't deserve to be here at all. But now he knew better. Because someone had stood up for him. And now he could stand up for himself. He took a deep breath, the soreness in his arms, the burn in his legs, the ache in his ribs all still there, but none of it mattered anymore. Because pain was part of the process, but it wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the voice that told him he wasn't good enough. The enemy was the doubt that made him wonder if he should quit. And today, he had beaten that enemy. Because if Mike Tyson could stand up for him, then maybe, just maybe, he could stand up for himself. And so, with his fists clenched at his sides and his legs still unsteady beneath him, he rose. The trainer had seen this kid struggle before, had seen him fall before, had seen him gasp for breath and collapse onto the mat more times than he could count. But today was different. Because when the fighter looked up at him, he didn't look away. He didn't drop his gaze. He didn't cower or brace for another insult or expect another attack. He just stood there, looking at the man who had spent months trying to tear him down, and in that moment, the trainer knew that he had failed. Because he hadn't broken him. He had built something stronger than he ever intended. Slowly, quietly, fighters started moving again. Heavy bags began to sway. Jump ropes slapped the ground. Gloves snapped against mitts. But it wasn't the same. Because everyone in that gym had just watched something that wasn't supposed to happen. A fighter had been broken down, but he had gotten back up. And the man who tried to break him? He was the one who looked defeated. The kid didn't leave. He didn't grab his bag and walk out the door like he had so many times before when exhaustion had pushed him past his limit. Instead, he stepped back onto the mat. Not because he was told to. Not because he had to prove something. But because he belonged there. And for the first time, he truly believed it. He could have. He could have tried to explain himself. He could have doubled down, barked another order, tried to claw back the authority that had been ripped from him. But he didn't. Because what could he say? He had lost his voice. And Mike Tyson? Mike Tyson had spoken. Mike didn't need to stay to see what happened next. He didn't need to watch the fighter continue his training. He didn't need to wait for the trainer to slink away, embarrassed, exposed, a man who had spent his life pretending to be tough, but who had just been humbled by someone who actually knew what toughness was. Mike already knew. Because this wasn't just about one fight. This was about every fight. The ones in the ring. The ones in the gym. The ones inside your own head. The ones that try to break you. And today, a fighter had learned how to stand. And that was the real victory. The gym had returned to its usual rhythm, gloves hitting bags, trainers calling out instructions, the familiar sounds of dedication filling the air. But something was different now, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. People had seen. People had heard. People had learned. The young fighter, still breathing heavy, still sore from exhaustion, stood among them. Not as the kid who had collapsed, not as the kid who had been yelled at, but as the kid who had gotten back up. And Mike had already done what he came to do. The trainer didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't demand. He had spent so much time controlling others, using fear and exhaustion to make himself feel like he was in charge. But today, he had been humbled in front of the very people he had tried to break. And as Mike walked past him, leaving the gym behind, he didn't need to say anything else, because the silence said it all. Mike Tyson didn't need to throw a punch that day. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to prove he was the toughest man in the room. Because real strength, it isn't about breaking people down. It's about lifting them up. And today, in that gym, standing beside a young fighter who had learned to stand for himself, Mike Tyson had done just that.